Hello. Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you from my backyard in Southern California in Los Angeles. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're taking care of yourself today. Today's Critter Chat is going to focus on an iconic animal that many of us recognize, and some of us may even have some sitting around. Today we're going to talk about flamingos. I love flamingos. I have some plastic flamingos that live in my yard. And by live, I mean they're plastic. They're not alive. You may hear some noises. I have two dogs that are here, and they are both in the backyard with me right now. So they may be moving around, and I don't think they'll come into the camera shot, but they might. So it's one of those days. But today we're going to talk about flamingos. We're going to talk a little bit about where they live, how they live, what they do, and yeah, kind of their oddities too. They're a very peculiar group of birds that kind of do things a bit different than most other bird species. To start off with, there are 6 different species of flamingos. They live in a variety of different places, although their habitats are usually have one big thing in common, and that is shallow water. Shallow water that has a good food source for them. So although there's 6 species and they're found in multiple continents across the world, they all kind of eat the same thing, and they all need to be in a very similar habitat, although some can live in more extreme versions of what that habitat may be. They live in North and South America. They live in Africa, and they live a bit in Europe and in Asia. So they have a pretty good global representation, but always near-ish the equator. Not too far out of that realm. Although occasionally there is a flamingo spotted pretty far from that space. They don't typically live too far away from warmer areas. They are one of the most social animals on the planet. Like people, they tend to stick together in big groups. Scientists call that gregarious. So that's kind of our new fun word for today. Gregarious means very social, large groups. With flamingos, they don't do well alone at all. They don't do well in small groups. They need a big group. A while back, there was some scientists who were doing some bird watching in Eastern Africa, and they identified one flock of flamingos, one big group, at over 1 million birds in one space that were all kind of hanging out and moving around together. Those would have been lesser flamingos. They tend to be in very huge groups. So there are 6 species. 4 of those are fairly common-ish in zoos around the world, and 2 are pretty much never seen in zoos. So we'll talk a little bit about the different species, and we'll talk about the biggest is called the greater flamingo. They got real creative with that name. Greater flamingos can be upwards of 5 feet tall, so they are good-sized height-wise. And they have a wingspan of about 5.5 feet. So that's also, it's decent. There are definitely birds with bigger wingspans out there. Yet they are, even for that height, they only weigh at 9 pounds. That's astounding, right? Something that's like super tall. If I was standing, it would come up just short of my shoulder. Yeah, so they're very tall, but very lightweight. And that's because, like most birds, they have hollow bones. And most of the height of a flamingo is its very skinny legs, or its very long and skinny neck. The bulk of a flamingo is pretty small. Their main body cavity is pretty small. Even like my little plastic ones here, not too big of a body. And their heads are pretty small too. Now I popped the leg off this one. We'll see if it'll still stay standing. You can hear my dogs rustling in the bushes. I'm sitting underneath a tree that has some fruit on it, and my dogs love to eat the fruit when it falls to the ground. So they are busy hunting for the fruit today. So we talked about the greater flamingos being the biggest. There is another species that is just slightly smaller than the greater flamingos. Those are called Caribbean or American flamingos. Oh, the greater flamingos are also the most pale pink. So they're very, very light colored pink. Sometimes they almost look white. And the other super tall one, the Caribbean or American flamingo, is very, very bright. It's one of the brightest species of flamingos. So if you see a super tall one, if it's pale pink, it's greater. If it's not as pale pink, it's probably a Caribbean or an American flamingo. The smallest species is called the lesser flamingos. So they're the littlest guys. They only measure under 3 feet in height. So kind of closer to what my little plastic ones are here, although they'd still be bigger than these guys by a bit. And they only get up to about 4.5 pounds. So they're pretty small with a 3.5 foot wingspan. So also not the biggest of wings. Both the greater and the lesser, so the biggest and the smallest, live in Africa. The lesser flamingos particularly love to live in huge groups, and they have an ability to live in the most extreme water situations. So there's some lakes in Africa that are kind of stagnant water. They don't have a lot of fresh water coming into them, and they don't have an outlet going out, so they're very salty. Some of them have extreme amounts of acids in them. And so it's a very harsh environment in some of those lakes, but the flamingos still live there. They eat the little tiny crustaceans that live in that lake, and the lesser flamingos tend to be able to handle the most extreme water situations of any of the flamingo species. The greater flamingos live in Africa, but they also live throughout the Middle East and throughout Southern Europe. And over into Asia, into India, and occasionally spotted into Southeast Asia in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, Thailand, etc. So they have kind of the broadest distribution, the greater flamingos do. Here in the Americas, we already briefly mentioned the Caribbean or the American flamingos. Those are the other really tall ones and the really bright colored ones. Those are typically around the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. So they live just at the very top of South America. Through Central America, throughout Mexico, around Cancun, you can actually see Caribbean or American flamingos in that area of Mexico, and throughout the islands of the Caribbean as well. Occasionally, those flamingos do live in the United States. So there's not a regular known place where there's always flamingos in the US, but they do see them anywhere between Texas and the Carolinas. So Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, and North and South Carolina. So they do sometimes see those flamingos around there. Now the other 3 species all live in South America. Of those, the most common is called the Chilean flamingo, and that is the other species that is found in zoos in the US. I've worked with Chilean flamingos a bit. Chilean flamingos are kind of a medium-sized flamingo, and they live along the coastline of South America. Now up higher in the mountains of South America, there's some big mountain lakes that are kind of that stagnant, salty, acidic water as well. And up there's a species of flamingos called the Andean flamingos, which is named after the Andes Mountains. These flamingos live at very high elevations. One thing that's kind of unique about them is that they have yellow legs, and so they kind of stick out for that reason. They're really pretty colorful with bright yellow legs. The other flamingo that is also South American and really kind of rare to be seen is called the James, or sometimes called the Puna flamingo. And they actually thought that species of flamingo was extinct, and they thought that in 1924. And it wasn't until 1957, so over 30 years later, that they rediscovered them, and they actually have a fairly stable population again. So that's good news, right? Flamingos can live pretty long lifespan. Out in the wild, it's typically 30 to 40 years, with some individuals going longer. In a zoo setting, it can easily be 50, sometimes 60, and sometimes longer years. So for being a very lightweight animal, they can really live a very long time, which is pretty cool. That's impressive. During that time, they will create very strong social bonds, not necessarily with their mate. That may change every year, or they may mate with this bird for like 2 or 3 years, and then they're like, we're tired with each other. Move on, mate with another bird for a few years, move on, keep moving on, while some of the others in their flock may stay together long term. But they do have friends for a long time, and that's something that I read that I thought was pretty cool. There's a flamingo scientist who's really studied their social behaviors, how they interact with each other. And he studied at a place in England. They have the 4 different species. So they have greater, lesser, Chilean, and American flamingos there. And he took photos of them every day, 3 different times during the winter months, 4 different times during the warmer southern months, summer months. And he would compare their ID bands, so he could easily identify in the photo who was who. And he noticed over time that certain flamingos were always together. And sometimes those were multiple male flamingos, multiple female flamingos, maybe just a group of little female flamingos, sometimes a group of male flamingos. The one group that he documented the most were 2 old lady flamingos, who then had a younger male flamingo that was 20 years younger than them. And the 3 of them were like stuck like glue to each other. Throughout his 4-year research period, almost every photo, those 3 birds were always together, which I thought that was pretty interesting. And there was no relation. They weren't siblings. They weren't mates at any one time. The younger male was not the offspring of either of the older females. So I thought that was really cool, that they kind of have these friendships that are ongoing years and years at a time. Flamingos, they have really good hearing, so they do communicate vocally. You've probably heard them if you've ever been to a zoo. They kind of squawk like geese a little bit. They make some little grunts and hissing sounds as well. You usually don't hear those unless you're their keeper and working with them in ways that they may not be so happy about. They also do a lot of communication with their body language. There's very specific behaviors that they'll do that kind of help identify their loyalty to the flock or to the group. And also things that they do that are very important leading into their breeding season. So one of those is a behavior called head flagging. So if you can imagine, my head is a flamingo head, and this is another flamingo, and this is another flamingo. They would all kind of turn their heads the same way at the same time. And I've seen a flock of flamingos do this when I was in Florida, in Tampa Bay at Busch Gardens. And it was really crazy to see because they all started doing this. And they got really close together and their heads would move synchronized with each other. And then after they did that for a while, they started the next very important behavior, which is called marching. And so they would all kind of walk together and flip their heads side to side as they would march. They looked kind of like a drill team or a bunch of cheerleaders, but it was really exciting to see how they moved together as a group. And then they would also do some things that are a little more like, hey, give me some space. One of those is that they'll kind of stretch out and stretch their neck out and flap their wings really quickly. That's like, hey, back off, I need some space. And they use their head and neck to kind of assert dominance or say like, hey, I'm the boss here. You need to give me more space. You need to go away. So it's pretty funny, the different body language that they have with each other. They also do something called preening, which is cleaning their feathers. but it's also a very specific thing that they do in pairs to kind of help symbolize their together as a pair to courtship. And they won't necessarily clean each other's feathers, but they'll both clean their own feathers at the same time in the same way. So if they're standing up, they'll both kind of tilt their head back and clean the feathers like on their left wing, and then turn around and clean their feathers on their right wing. But it's kind of like synchronized preening that they do, which I thought was also very interesting. Flamingos have webbed feet like a duck. So on their feet, they have 4 toes. 3 of those are in the front, and then their little toe is kind of in the back. And when they bend their legs, it looks like they bend them the wrong direction. That's because all of this is their foot bone, and then they can kind of bend like that. This is their ankle. We look at it and we think it's their knee, and we think it bends the wrong direction, but it's actually their ankle, and everything below that bend middle of the leg is their foot. So they kind of stand on their tippy toes, and then they can move their leg up and down like that. And they often stand on one leg. There's different theories about that, to stay hot, stay cool, to stay warm, but they do that in both cool and warm places, so it's kind of strange. They may also just be resting their legs. We don't really know. It's one of those things we're still figuring out. Let's talk a little bit about baby flamingos. So after they breed and after their special courtship dance with all their head flagging and marching and stuff, they will then pair up. Like I said, they sometimes pair up with the same bird, sometimes they don't. Typically for the flamingos at the LA Zoo that I worked with a bit, they would keep very meticulous records of who was paired with who. And some of those birds would pair up for a long time together. Sometimes it was a new bird every breeding season. So it was really kind of hit and miss. Sometimes they'd go a couple years very successfully, and then all of a sudden they would each choose a different mate for the next season. So it really didn't have a lot of logical sense to it, but it was kind of interesting to see that occur. They build nest out of mud. Their nest building's incredible. Their nests are usually between 1 foot and 2 feet tall off the ground. And it's entirely made of mud. Sometimes they'll pull some grass or little sticks or reeds, like this plant behind me, to help kind of give it some form early on, but it's mostly mud. They'll only pull in vegetation if that's readily available. Out in the wild, it's not available in most of their areas. In a zoo setting, it's a little more available. But their mud nest is very tall, and then they'll lay usually only 1 egg. The eggs are good size. They're about this big. They're very chalky white, kind of to the touch too. They're not like very smooth. They almost feel powdery as you touch them. They both will take turns incubating the egg. The male and the female both take turns sitting on it. Sometimes if one of the birds is more bossy, that bird will incubate the egg a little more. That's typically a female, but not always. They will incubate the egg for about a month. It's specifically between 27 and 31 days. And then when the baby hatches, the chick, it's usually gray or white. The babies I've seen have always been white, but that may have just been the species that I was working with have white babies. But in all the reading that I did, it said gray or white. The baby will stay on the nest for about 2 weeks. And during that time, both the mom and the dad come and feed the baby. We've talked a little bit about bird digestion before. And birds have this very special place in their digestive tract called a crop. And it's before the stomach. That's the important part. It kind of starts to digest their food. For bigger things like, or birds that we're maybe more familiar with, like chickens, we sometimes call that a gizzard. But the crop is where their food goes first. We talked about it with vultures, that their food goes in their crop, and they store that food and bring it back to their babies. With flamingos, what they're eating is already so tiny. It's little tiny crustaceans, some algae, sometimes some little snails. very tiny, tiny things. And as they kind of eat those, it goes into their crop. And in their crop, when there's babies around, it creates this liquidy substance that scientists have called crop milk. It's kind of very pink in color. Sometimes it looks more red, depending on what the flamingos are eating. It can almost look like blood. I have seen photos of that where flamingos feeding their chick, it looks like there's blood coming out of their mouth or out of their beak. But it's the crop milk that they feed the baby. The parents will feed the baby up until the time it is ready to fly. So that can usually be a couple of months. However, at about a month old to 6 weeks old, the baby starts to leave the nest. And when it does that, it will join up with other baby flamingos, and they all hang out in a big group together. They're very social birds, so the babies are very social with each other once they're able to walk around and move and swim. And they call those groups crèche, which is a kind of a French word that denotes babies. Yeah, I don't know for sure what that word means, but it's a common word that scientists use to talk about like a nursery group, a group of youngsters, a group of babies. But these baby flamingos hang out in a crèche in this group up until the time that they're flying, and that's usually at like 3 or 4 months old. During that time, they have kind of fluffy feathers. They grow very fast. I was amazed when I was working with zookeepers taking care of flamingos at the LA Zoo. They would sometimes be hand raising the babies if the parents weren't doing a very good job. And I would see the baby like 1 week, and then I'd see the baby a week later, and it was like this the first week, and the next week it was like this big already. So they grow really, really quick. You may have seen baby flamingos at a zoo. Sometimes they're as tall as their adults, and they're still covered in kind of that gray, fluffy down feathering because they can grow really quick. Those birds could still be like 2 or 3 months old, but already the height of their parents. It takes them about 2 or 3 years before they're fully mature to where they can have babies of their own. What else was I going to talk about? Oh, the way that they eat is pretty cool. So they have webbed feet, kind of like a duck. That helps them to swim if they're in deep water, but it also helps them in their feeding behavior. So they'll use their webbed feet to kind of stamp in the water, and that kind of moves all the sediment on the bottom of the water up and down and gets it all flowing around. And then they stick their beak into the water upside down, and they clack the two parts of the beak open and shut very quickly, and that pumps water in through their mouth and back out. So they kind of bring it in through the front and push it out the sides. And then they have special structures inside their beak called lapillae, and that helps filter the food out as they're eating. So again, they're eating things like little crustaceans, like little tiny shrimps, little snails or mollusks, and then they do eat some algae as well. And all of those things in those kind of harsh water environments that they live, which is sometimes also the ocean. They are sometimes found in coastal areas, although they usually prefer the kind of the slower areas. They're not at the beach with the waves. They're kind of in the little bay off to the side that's a little more quiet and controlled. But all of those things that they eat, the shrimps and the mollusks and the algae, all have kind of the same color thing going on with them, and it's called carotenoids. And that's a pigment that's found in those that gives the flamingos their unique pinkish color. So they get their color from their food. Now, sometimes what that looks like is really bright, like my plastic flamingos that are here with me today. But in some species, it's never going to be that bright. Specifically, the greater flamingos, they always look a very pale, pale pink. Even if they're eating tons of this food that has a lot of the color in it, they're still going to be pink, pale pink. They're not going to ever be as bright as some of their other cousins. that was always kind of funny at zoos. Sometimes people would ask, why are your flamingos not brighter? Well, it's because of the specific species of flamingo that they are. So moving on to talk about that a little bit with my experience as a zookeeper. When I was training to be a zookeeper, one of the areas I was cross-trained in was taking care of the flamingos. And before I officially became a keeper and was a volunteer, one of the areas I worked a lot as a volunteer was with the flamingos. And it was really remarkable for me to see the complexity of the flamingo society. That was the thing that really stood out the most, is how individual birds really liked each other, or individual birds didn't like each other. Sometimes they'd be kind of like jealous of each other. If like these birds over here had a baby, but they had kind of a feud going with these birds over here and their baby didn't hatch. The two that didn't have the baby hatch would sometimes try to be mean to this baby. All sorts of crazy drama like that. Again, a very social species that has very complex social relationships. Was really interesting. In working with flamingos, I was often very turned off a little bit by the smell, because they live in some pretty harsh environments out in the wild. Their water is also where they poop a lot, and their food kind of stinks because it's like little, in the zoo setting, it's made into pellets like dog food, but it comes from those same little ocean creatures or sea creatures that are little shrimps and snails and stuff. So it's like dehydrated shrimps and snails, so it also kind of stinks. I often found that like cleaning out the area where the flamingos spent the night was usually pretty stinky. And then I learned that flamingos don't have a sense of smell. I'm like, oh, well, that works out really nice for them because they kind of are really stinky animals. And ever since that time frame in which I was working with them on a regular basis, if I go to a zoo, and it can be a zoo I've never been to, I can usually smell the flamingos before I ever see the flamingos. I'll sometimes hear them before I see them as well, but like if that smell crosses my path, I know that there's flamingos nearby, because they are pretty stinky. Now we usually kind of end our critter chat talking a little bit about some of the threats they face and some of the conservation work that is being done to work with them. That's usually kind of a grim time, and it's usually a little sad. I'm happy to report that none of the flamingo species are endangered. There is a species that's vulnerable. There are 3 species that are threatened, and the other 2 are actually both going up in numbers. So that's really good news across the board, that there aren't any that are super endangered of becoming extinct, because they are beautiful birds. They are an icon of many things in society, and I have yet to see wild flamingos up close. I did see them when I was in Africa, and we flew from the one place we stayed to the other place we stayed. We were up high in a little plane. We flew over a huge lake, and I could see tons of the flamingos flying way down below us. But that was about as close as I ever came to seeing them in the wild. I do hope to someday see them a little closer in the wild, and we'll see if that happens. Our special shout out today for a conservation organization that's doing some good work for flamingos is called the Flamingo Specialist Group. They are a bunch of scientists and also sometimes some zookeepers, and also just people who are passionate about flamingos, or people who live in areas where flamingos sometimes show up. But they'll kind of allow anybody to be part of their group, which I thought was really cool. So if you're passionate about flamingos, you can also join their group and help learn more about them and help spread awareness of the beautiful birds that are flamingos. But that concludes our critter chat today. I'll be posting some more information about flamingos up on the Zoo Nerd Facebook, so check that out. And as always, feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and share any of the Zoo Nerd content. And full episodes of these critter chats are uploaded daily to Facebook and YouTube. And sometimes when Instagram lets me, they get saved as an IGTV feature on the Instagram profile, but sometimes it cuts it off and only shows about a minute of it. So we'll see how that works today. It's an ongoing struggle of what Instagram receives. So we'll see from there. All right, but take care, have fun, be happy, be healthy, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye.